Good morning and happy Father's Day. This day can bring a host of emotions, each of them perfectly real and valid, and is unique to each person, as each of our fathers are to us. This morning, with my own dad on the other side of the continent in California, I can't help but think of the many hats my dad has worn throughout my life. He's been a role model, a friend, an ATM, but most importantly for me, he's been a teacher. I think I was blessed with a particularly wise dad, but maybe all of us think that, and sometimes maybe none of us do. But when I look back on my life, it's colored by the wisdom that my dad has been sprinkling into it all along. When I was younger, I knew I could always go to him and get wise counsel and good advice. And as I've gotten older, I've learned to hear his voice in my head as I make decisions. My brothers and I can even quote little tidbits of wisdom he's given to us many times over the years. But the most important thing that I've learned from him is that in all things, the wise thing to do is to remain humble. So far in the book of James, we have seen how the Christian faith is meant to inform our behavior. If we claim to be followers of Christ, that should be evident in our actions and in the way we treat one another. But here James takes it a step further. These actions that we must take are a fruit of the wisdom that only comes from God. Many people claim to have wisdom, but James warns us to be aware not only of false wisdom in those around us, but of the false wisdom in ourselves. This false wisdom is expert at convincing us it is real, but it always gives itself away by its central belief that we are the center of our own universe. False wisdom allows us to see others merely as in their relationship to us. It tells us that their worth and humanity are dependent on whether or not we like them. When we are the center of our own story, everyone else becomes supporting characters in the story of our life, fitting into appropriate roles and tropes as mentor, love interest, antagonist, extra. Their entire personhood is defined by what they mean to us. Sometimes this enables us to have great and deep love, deeper than we would be able to do without it. Sometimes it justifies hatred, anger, and malice that no child of God deserves to have directed at them. And most of the time, it allows us to ignore other people completely, forgetting the responsibility that we all have to each other. A few weeks ago, Chris preached on the human tendency towards partiality. When we look back at the history of the world, the history of our country, even the history of our own community, so much of the harm and evil that has been done has come out of our insistence on partiality, our insistence that we are separate and superior to someone else. James tells us that this partiality is the fruit of false wisdom. False wisdom tells us that this is a dog-eat-dog world. We live in a world of scarcity, and there is nowhere near enough to go around. I have to watch out for me and mine. If someone gets in the way of that, well, I should move them out of the way. And I certainly won't go around going out of my way to help them along, because what if I fall behind? We make excuses for our friends who are ours and see the worst in our enemies who we believe are separate. We look at the world from the vantage point of our own ego. False wisdom views success, prosperity, even rights as a zero-sum game. If I get too caught up in caring about others, what will happen to me? Will I have less? Will I fall behind? False wisdom says I can't feed the whole world and forgets that we can feed the person sitting in front of us. We justify our selfishness as being realistic and practical. When we are the center of our own story, we can justify any number of things to put our own protagonist of our own story in the front. False wisdom will always view the world through the lens of me. But true wisdom views the world through the lens of the gospel. True wisdom knows that our world, our fellow humans, our very selves have been and are being reconciled to God. True wisdom knows that the person standing in front of me, without exception, is an image bearer of God, worthy of love, dignity, honor, and respect. Only through this true wisdom from God can we move beyond our partiality. Only when we recognize the expansiveness of what God is already doing in the world can we see beyond ourselves into the interconnectedness and restored community that God is calling us into. James tells us that the first quality of this true wisdom is pure. Pure from the driving factors that motivate the false wisdom. Purity in opposition to the self-ambition of false wisdom. When we hold the center of our own universe, we corrupt the whole project. Our reality, when looked at through the lens of self-importance and self-aggrandizement, becomes colored by our own selfishness. The purity of true wisdom, then, necessitates that we first must recognize the truth that God, who is love, is in fact at the center of the universe. Only when we hold that love as the basin from which our every movement pours out can we move into the world with purity of spirit. James tells us that this true wisdom is full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. God's grace is enough to cover me and the person next to me. I don't have to compete with them. Too often we understand God's love and faithfulness as a zero-sum game. A friend to all is a friend to none. And if God is my friend, then surely he is my enemy's enemy. God couldn't love those who mistreat those who God loves. We see this in the story of Jonah, when even a prophet of God resents God for sparing the Ninevites. I have too often been the Jonah in my own life. That worldview forgets that I too have mistreated those who God loves. I have served as someone else's enemy, whether intentionally or not, willfully or not. I am as much in need of God's grace as my neighbor. We have accepted the worldview of us versus them. There is a wall between us and our enemy, and if we accept this model, the only way for God to be on our side is for God to not be on our enemy's side. But who are we to think that God is on our side anyway? Is the Christian not called to be on God's side? What if we abandoned this model of us versus them altogether? What if instead we understood that grace is not God choosing a side, but God pulling us closer to themselves? True wisdom teaches us that God's love is no longer a zero-sum game. What we find instead is that as we move closer to God, we move closer to each other. And as we move closer to each other, we move closer towards God. Grace is so much deeper than merely the forgiveness of guilt. Grace is God working with us to move forward. As Dale said this morning in class, it only works together when we work together. When we come together through God's grace as all of God's children, the true wisdom of humility unifies us to enact God's will in the world. This unifying true wisdom, says James, is peace-loving, considerate, submissive, and willing to yield. Today marks the 20-year anniversary of a woman preaching here at the Stanford Church of Christ. While many in our tradition and the church at large remain stuck in certainty about what they have always believed, this church family, ahead of its time, found the humility to ask if we were actually right. In humility, we turned our consideration to those in our community who God was lifting up, and those we were blocking from answering that call. We asked ourselves where God's hand was and where it was leading us, and those in charge had the humility to then submit themselves to the women that God was lifting up, and in doing so, submitted to God herself. Out of this, we have seen 2 decades of good fruit and leadership in our tradition. But we never would have seen this in our community if we had held on to our own certainty, if we had held on to our false wisdom. When we realize that we are not the center of our own world, we also see that we might not have all the answers. And when we do that, we see the answers that God is putting in our laps. It's this humility that can only come from God that produces the fruit of true wisdom. It's this humility that only comes from God that leads to the enacted faith we see in the letter from James. It's this humility that only comes from God that empowers us to be the hands and feet of God in a world that is being reconciled. This week, consider who and where God is calling you to be reconciled with through the humility that God has already gifted you.